welcome everyone. I am really excited to have this conversation with Dave. Dave, for those of you who don't know, is one of the OGs of the B2B design. He's working in security now, he's worked in insurance tech, he's worked in marketing data. So Dave has made a design impact for probably the most quote unquote boring industries. So I am really excited. Dave, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Well, what one person thinks that's boring, someone else finds super fascinating, which is, I guess, I'm falling to that camp. Yeah, thanks. So it's great to be here. Yeah, well, I guess I'll introduce myself originally. So I am Dave Rolnitzky. I am currently the director of design at a company called Vanta. And Vanta's mission is to secure the internet and protect consumer data. So as Prayag says, again, some people may find that boring. I think it's super fascinating. We've got a terrific team there, and I joined relatively recently, so I'm really excited about that. Before I came to Vanta, though, as Prayag said, I've been in B2B for a while. I'm actually from the Midwest originally, so I came out here. I drove out to the West Coast in my bad beat up Honda Civic. And I was really excited to join this whole internet thing that was happening in Silicon Valley, was sort of the epicenter. So that was super, super exciting to me. I have a background in marketing. I find, that's how I started my career. And one of the things that I was really interested in and why I was attracted to marketing and why that was a great fit with the early web was really interested in customer behavior. So that's how I started my career. And did that for a while, worked with some small companies and learned a lot, and slowly got involved with some usability testing and some small other design projects, and decided that I really wanted to focus on that and focus on helping users navigate this new thing called the World Wide Web, and decided I wanted to actually build products and focus on that side of the house. And that's when I had the great privilege of going to grad school, and that was a great experience. And that's where we actually connected for the first time.
Yeah, and that's when we started our company. That's how we know each other. Dave and I co-founded a company called LeadGenius, and we ran it together for, 8 years or something like that. And that's where I learned from Dave the impact that design can have on B2B companies. And fun fact, and Dave, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but you were part of the team that holds the Guinness Book of World Record for most software downloads in 24 hours. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm part of the team. That was a team effort. That's when I worked at Mozilla. It's probably the only world record I'll ever be a part of. It certainly won't be in an athletic world record. So anyway, I enjoyed that. That was a great team and a great experience. But yeah, that taught me a lot about sort of, Mozilla had a bunch of really world-class people working on the marketing side. I was really fortunate to join them. But they had a lot of great design talent too. This is early days Mozilla also, when everyone could sort of fit around a conference table. And that was one of the was really interested in getting into design just based on the great work that they were doing in the web development community, especially.
Yeah, and back now we're dating ourselves, but when we first started LeadGenius, you had previously worked in Mozilla, you brought that experience, but LeadGenius is a B2B marketing data company. And back when we started that, maybe 10, 11 years ago, the design was still a relatively new concept, even on the consumer side, right? Like people were starting to wake up to the idea that consumer internet needs good design. And you were one of the first people, to kind of bring that same thinking into the B2B side. There weren't a lot of software B2B companies who were prioritizing design. And it seems like, that trend has caught on, and the things have definitely changed a lot in the last 10 years. So I would love to get your take on how do you see and why do you see that that evolution has happened. What do you see the role of design? How has it changed in the B2B context in the last 10, 12 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy B2B software, and you get to design software that's used by people every day. Sometimes they're not super excited to use software that their company provides. It's not like TikTok. A lot of people talk about delightful software, and certainly like if you're in social media or you have a favorite consumer app or something, that's certainly the case. But a lot of times, like, people aren't maybe necessarily delighted with their accounting software or their financial software or something. So one of the things that I really enjoy doing with B2B software is how can we bring a more just a better experience for people that are in that software working every single day, maybe because they have to, because somebody else decided they have to use that. And I think at LeadGenius, we really thought a lot about that. How do we make an experience for folks that's more efficient, when they were using our software? And I think that's so important to keep in mind, because again, people are in there every day. Can you save people clicks? Can you make their life just a little bit more efficient, or just a little bit more more delightful, I guess I would say.
Yeah, and I think one thing that, in my experience, what I've seen is because the consumer internet and that ecosystem is now, a good design is default. Feel like people have started to ask the question, hey, why isn't my business software that my company bought for me, why isn't it as delightful, or at least as well designed as the software that I'm using in my day-to-day life? So feel like the expectations of the users have changed. People don't put up with crappy software anymore, let's say, as much as they used to.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of crappy software out there, carefully designed software.
Yeah, I mean, that's so true. I think that's a really great thing too, that now the default is this has to be really great, no matter what industry you're in, or no matter what business users or B2B users you're designing for. I think that's a really terrific change that the industry has evolved to over time. Certainly wasn't always like that, but you still get that a little bit today. I think people sort of are like, yeah, we really don't want to, put time into, maybe into admin tools or something like that. But, there are people in it every day, using it every day. So the mindset, I think we're getting there, but the mindset, I think, should continue to be, hey, why can't it be, a more engaging, easier to use software? There's no reason that it can't be now.
And I think that's going to continue to evolve. I think, people realize that companies would realize that cutting corners, especially when it comes to kind of good user experience and good design, is ultimately detrimental to the bottom line. So that brings me on to my next question. It is, what is, it's not as easy to do good design in B2B. It has its own kind of unique challenges. And one of the big ones that I have seen is this idea that, a lot of times the leadership does not come from a design background or even a product background. How do you convince them that design is a priority, that it is something that we should be spending time on and effort on and resources on? How do you make that case to a leadership that might be stuck in a little bit of kind of an old school thinking?
Yeah, well, I mean, luckily, I think that's changed over time, right? Like, design, I think, has become much more ubiquitous, in all industries, and kind of the importance of it. There's like studies, I feel like, that are coming out all the time talking about how to prove the case numerically about design. One of the big consulting firms had something that came out in the last year or something about, sort of making the case for why design, the importance of user experience. So it's getting easier and easier to make that case. I think, like, any organization that wants to be focused on customers, I think, is going to pay attention to design and really provide that resources. And I would say that design isn't just, as designers, I think, we're thinking about that every day, but really a great user experience is important in every aspect of the organization, right? Like we're all at some level, we're all need to make sure that we're having a great user experience, whether you're in support or whether you're in sales or marketing. Like all those things need to work together to make sure that you are focused on the customer every day. So I think, like, as an organization, it's really critical that that you're focused in every group on design and providing a fantastic experience.
Got it. So it seems like the case that we need to make to the leadership is, hey, it's not just good design of the software or the user experience, customer experience, kind of all the way from, whenever you touch a customer, how do you bring a little bit of, joy, improve their experience a little bit. And it seems like that's a more holistic case that we need to make, rather than just the case for like, hey, good design is better for business, like good end-to-end customer experience is better for business.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was talking maybe a little bit, philosophically at a high level around why it's important, but like, I think there are plenty of, if you are saving, if your design helps reduce the number of support tickets, right? If your design helps, decrease the amount of time, and in some ways, and that's the opposite for B2B software, but the time that a user needs to complete a task, like, those are all things that you can measure and you can show, and you can bring that to leadership and say, well, it's not just about spending a lot of time polishing the UI, although I think that's important cohesively, and you could make the case for that. Certainly there's tools now, even with design systems, are getting sophisticated enough where you can make some of those cases. But whether leadership is into numbers, right, or whether they're in the more qualitative reasons that I talked about before, I think there's the case is easier than ever, I think, to make on why it's important. And also your competitors are doing it, right? Just like looking out across the sea of competitors that you might be competing against in B2B. If you're not sort of paying attention to design, paying attention to your customers, talking with them regularly, you're going to fall behind. So.
Good. And do you feel that, first of all, when you looking back at your experience, did you ever feel, B2B design is still considered a cost center? Did you ever feel like you had to make a numbers driven, like ROI driven case for design? And a lot of times, you can make that case, like you mentioned, but a lot of time it's just a qualitative. Hey, if our competitors are doing it, if we don't do it, we'll fall behind. How do you make a case? So you've seen it from both sides, right? Like you were running a company of several hundred people, and then you joined you joined all these companies as the head of design, and you had case made to you, and then you had to make case for on your behalf. How do you make that ROI case? Could you walk us through kind of some of the steps you could take on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you were CEO at the time, and so I don't know how much I had to convince you or not. Maybe you're still not convinced. I don't know. I think it's you have to know your audience a little bit too. But I mean, we talked a little bit about sort of making the quantitative case. So if you're a business and you are interested in increasing revenue, and that might mean also saving on the cost side, I think there's the case to be made, right? So good usability can often translate into less support tickets, less support contacts. We talked about the competitive reasons, right? We talked about efficiency on the consumer side, right? Making things more efficient. A lot of companies, rightly or wrongly, are measuring their success also on customer satisfaction. So if people aren't satisfied because they can't get your software to do the task they need to do, that's a problem. And a lot of people that report on that, and have, maybe their pay even associated with that, and that can be a challenge too.
I remember one thing you did, and I think you also you did that at Applied Systems in India. You're talking about this, you'd come to me and basically said, there's this hypothesis driven approach that we have, where our hypothesis is, if you invest time in these features or this user experience, we will drive new revenue. If we invest in these features, we'll drive more retention and customer satisfaction. If we invest in this third feature, we'll drive down costs, right? Could you talk a little bit about that? That made it very clear to me as to here are investment areas from design and product perspective that we can make, and that made the decision very easy to make.
Well, I think what we've sort of been talking about is kind of the business metrics and the business cases around a lot of these things and how you can tie that back to design. But I think as designers and design organizations, it's really about the behavior that you want to influence, right? Yeah. And the outcomes that you want to achieve with that behavior, right? So I think you can always tie those to the specific business metrics, but thinking about not just in terms of retention, right, or in terms of revenue or some of those hard business metrics, which I think are really important, but thinking about what's the purpose or what's the outcome that you want to achieve? What customer problem are you solving for those users? And sometimes that gets lost a little bit because I think we're so focused on, and rightly so, on revenue and churn numbers and everything else. But when you are solving a customer problem, those things are directly feed into some of those hard business metrics. And I think it's super important to be focused on that. With small teams, it's really important to really, when you think about being user-centered, right? Especially we are, working at LeadGenius, working on LeadGenius together, to really make sure that everyone is contributing in that process of being user-centered, right? And talking with customers regularly. It's a team effort. It can't just be, designer go off and you talk to some customers and then we pitch it over the wall and translate it. It's so important that everyone is actually involved in that process in some degree.
Yeah, that's another thing that I wanted to discuss, because B2, even if the leadership is convinced and you can say, hey, you can never tie hard numbers. You can never say, if I build this feature, revenue is going to go up by 10%. I think, or retention is going to go up by 10%. But you can make a case investing in these behaviors would drive, or investing in these areas would drive certain behaviors that we can influence. And a lot of that knowledge comes from actually talking to your users and customers. And that seems to be a relatively harder challenge in B2B than it is in consumer, right? First of all, how do you give your leadership, how do you convince your leadership that you want design team to be talking to the customers and getting their feedback? How do you get that buy-in, number one? And even if you have that buy-in, how do you work around kind of the customer gatekeepers, the success teams, the sales teams? How do you convince them that bringing you and talking to customers is going to be important for what they are trying to achieve? So this access to customer is a big problem when it comes to B2B, and I'm curious how you solve that in your Applied Systems or at Vanta. How are you solving that problem?
Yeah, so I think that I've been really fortunate to work in most of the places I've worked in. The organizations have recognized the importance of designers having access to customers, or at least tag teaming on calls and working in conjunction with their customer success managers or their support team. And again, we talked about a team effort, and sort of everybody should have kind of user experience. Everyone in some ways is a user experience person, right? Regardless of role that you're in. I think we all know those games of telephone, right? Where we're talking and things get lost in translation. Well, the same thing happens in organizations where you're not allowing designers and product people to connect with customers directly, right? Things get lost in translation, even if it's up 5% the first time. maybe put in a report and then people interpret it a different way, and suddenly, you're losing 20-25% of the context, and you're not able to ask kind of the the deep probing questions that you might need to as a designer who's actually designing the thing that you're going live to, or you're going to go live to your customers with. That's why I think it's so important to actually work together on those things, and to really just hear those things firsthand and be able to ask probing questions. I think that's really critical.
And I think one thing that has that we did well, obviously the leadership, you and I and the co-founders were very convinced at LeadGenius again that we should be talking to customers, the product team should be talking to customers, but we were selling into these large enterprises, and our sales team and our customer success team used to be like nervous. Oh, what would they say? And I don't want to give you access to these customers. I think one of the things that really helped was this idea of hey, if you bring us in, we can actually help you close this deal. Or if you bring us in, we could help you. Giving access to different parts of the org is actually useful to your job. We'll help you get to your quota, to your goals. I think that was a case that I think you made that was really helpful, and I think that the team really warmed up to that.
Well, we were easy sells, right? Because it was us in some ways.
It's true. It is a lot easier when the leadership is like, no, this needs to happen, and then
But I don't think I've ever, and maybe I've just been lucky, but I don't think, I understand why folks are sort of protective of those relationships and everything too. But I think it's really rare when, if as a customer you have, you're talking to product or design people directly about the changes that they can help you make as a customer to help improve the product that you're in every day, right? To make it suck less, right?
Right.
And I think it's rare when I've been in a conversation where it's like, man, I wish that they didn't really want me in there. Usually they just want someone to talk to and talk through the issues. And, it's so critical to hear that information directly from them.
Yeah, and I think that knowledge is expanding in the world of sales and marketing and customer success as well. That,
for sure.
Hey, bringing in these designers and product people would actually help us.
You don't want to burden the customers, but I think customers are also really dying, I think, to get feedback on their product, especially if they care about your product. If they're not willing to give you feedback, maybe that's not a great sign in a lot of ways.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So there is this other additional complication in B2B software that I know you faced at Applied Systems, and we talked about it, where your customers are not your users. You know what I mean? So, you don't have, or nobody in your company has a direct relationship with the end users. That's happening less and less now, but, it's still, especially on the enterprise side, it's still a big challenge. How do you overcome that when nobody in your company has access to actual users? How do you get user feedback for good design?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. And sometimes, the customers that you have, they're, for a variety of reasons, uncomfortable with you talking with their customers, right?
Right.
And in some cases, we talked about making kind of the case for why that's important. And sometimes you can do that, and sometimes you just can't. And that's what happens. So the next best thing is, what are the are there proxies for those folks? Are there other people in related industry that you could talk to, right? Or are there folks internally that have worked in industry in the past? Certainly, we were really fortunate that we had a lot of people that had industry experience and could kind of represent that point of view. Are there trade groups or conferences, things like that, where you can get kind of an approximation to that group? So it's not always easy, but sometimes I think even getting feedback that from groups that maybe are sort of a proxy for that group is really helpful too.
So even if you can't get access to the exact customer, so I think you were talking about India/Applied System, where your users were your customers,
Mm-hmm.
and your customers you had to basically go through those customers to actually get access to their customers, and they were obviously not super thrilled by the idea of one of their vendors talking to their customers.
Yeah.
But I remember you had this really, you did a really great job at like building out this panel of users that you were talking to. Was this built through the proxy system, going to conferences, kind of talking to people in industry? Is that how you built that panel, or were you able to get your customers to give access to their customers, to the end users?
Yeah, it was a multi-pronged approach, certainly. And so like we looked at sort of all avenues, and we did have access to some of those end customers also. We had prompts in the product as well, to sort of recruit people in that way. And I think that was really helpful. We used Marvin software for a lot of that collection as well. So that was really handy. Getting back to your point about sort of like users to talk to, maybe if you don't have access, like I'll go back to when at our own company, right? So we were working with international folks, and we didn't have the budget to go fly internationally and necessarily talk to all the end users. And this is like early days, right? Where it's like we're working on mobile phones, but this is like candy bar phones. And so like how can you get sort of a proxy for folks that the folks that we were working with were
and this is before Zoom and before
all that, and
the widespread internet.
Right.
Yeah. This is way before that. Yeah.
We were definitely like, on a ramen budget there, I guess. Right. And so, so we tried to find folks that had less technology experience by going out and talking with groups that worked with folks that had lower computer literacy, right? As sort of a proxy for that. Like, could they understand kind of our interfaces on mobile phones and things like that? So I think there are creative ways, if you don't have access directly to customers, that you can employ that can help you get some of those insights.
And yeah, that was kind of one of the more fascinating things you did. Just for everybody's clarity, so when we were early on building our own company, the initial product was for people internationally, and we had users in India and Eastern Europe, and back then, especially our target audience didn't have access to the internet, and the only way to kind of do these studies was to fly out there, but we didn't have the budget to fly out there, so we didn't know if our interface was resonating, if our value proposition was resonating. So we found kind of parallel communities in our kind of local neighborhood, local area, and tried to approximate the response, and then validate it through some phone calls and through kind of more guerrilla research. But it was super helpful to even if we were not getting feedback straight from the exact users, but we were getting feedback from close enough that it was a good proxy, and I thought that was really, really helpful. That's and coming back to kind of the point about the panel, I think initially when you came into India, you did initially struggle with like building out that panel of actual users to talk to, or even proxy users to talk to. But you, through this, using kind of in-product prompts, using Marvin, all of that, seemed like you were still able to get, build out a pretty decent sized panel. It seemed like, but that took a while. I think the lessons that I learned from that, it seemed like you took a long time to build that panel, but once you had that, it was super easy to kind of get back to it and get direct feedback, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's so many pieces to that, I think, that are pretty resource intensive. I mean, now you have, the rise of really research operations. I mean, that's really a full-time gig to get some of those systems up and running, and so software, I think, can help you with a lot of that, but sometimes, it takes a lot of people power. But that's why having, if you don't have a research ops person, I think, it can be time intensive, but it's important to have a really good process for your research too, right? So it's not just about like recruiting the people, then it's like, okay, what are you doing? What are you doing with those users? How do you plan on reaching out to them? I think that the planning piece of that is also really critical. So it's not just about having them, how do you actually talk to them?
So it takes time and effort to build that first that database, that panel, and then it takes time and effort to learn and teach your team how to recruit from that panel. If you have access to design ops or research ops, that's great. But if you don't, you just it's important, it seems, to kind of keep building towards it and keep working on it.
Yeah, for sure. And then, I mean, so just the recruitment and sort of the process for how to get those people is one thing, right? And then it's about how do you be purposeful about reaching out to those users, right? It's interesting because there's so many times I think, we hear about people like, just talk to your customers, right?
Talk to your users.
Talk to your users, right? It's got the t-shirt too. I want one of those t-shirts.
Yeah.
It's so important to do that. And I think like universally you hear about people talking about that, but so many times, like, I think people don't have a plan for what you're going to talk to them about, right? Or they'll just like, put a single mock-up in front and be like, well, what do you think, right? And I think like, even if you're not an expert, and I've worked with a lot of really great researchers before, if you don't have access to a research or something, it's just some of the basic steps of just like, how are you going about asking questions in a thoughtful way? How are you preparing for that interview? Even if you don't have to come up with, a 100-page process document, but going in with a plan, right? Be purposeful, like write out your hypotheses. So, we've tried to do in the past, and what I try and focus on now is, are you hypothesis driven, right? So thinking about what are your hypotheses going into that process? What do you want to get out of it? And then, really leaving space for people to answer open-ended questions is really important. I mean, we could do a whole session, and there's probably a lot of experts in the Marvin community that could talk more eloquently than I could about this. But I think just going in and having a plan, you've got the panel, you've got the people recruited, have a plan for what you want to find out, and even just some basic questions, right? Really, at the end of the day, it's about mitigating risk in a lot of ways, right? How do you mitigate? You're never going to get to 100%, 100% feeling confident that this, well, maybe in some cases, but in many cases, you're not going to be 100% confident in your design, for example. But how do you get close enough with the people that you have to make it worth a development team working on that product and actually spending time on it? Like that's kind of the name of the game.
Yeah. It's in some way it's easier. In some way it's harder, but in some way it's easier, because the goal is to, it's not an ephemeral goal like engagement or virality, right? Like the goal is, hey, how do we just get our sometimes fairly limited number of users to like our product. There's actually a really interesting question came in on the Q&A. This idea that, when you have these proxy users or even your own user, you usually have separate personas, right? Do you try, and then you talk to people with separate personas? Do you try to build design differently for each persona, or do you really, the person the Q&A is asking, they basically their leadership team is saying, oh, we need to build individual design for different types of users. Is that the right thing to do? Or, and if not, then how do we kind of make a case that actually there needs to be one product that needs to be used by multiple, same product that needs to be tested and designed for multiple users?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. And I think it really varies widely depending on your company size, your stage, your team, for example. For us, like and from experience with smaller companies, sometimes I think just because you're pretty limited in resources, can you pick the one or two groups that you think are most important, that are going to really drive the product? Because your product can't be all things to all people, especially at a smaller size. And I think a lot of
even at bigger companies, if you design for everybody, you're not going to design for anybody.
Yeah,
right?
no, and I think that's totally true. And sometimes it's when you don't have that focus, I think you're off in a lot of different directions that can be really, really hard. So I think picking out, maybe it's like do you have kind of a list of the most important, personas that you want to sort of reach and start with those? Maybe you submit a list of 10 and really secretly you're only going to do 1 or 2 of those, and just focus on that and making that a really great experience. But it depends, on the goals of your company and like we talked about, size and resources and things like that. So there's not necessarily one size fits all.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I agree with you. I think it's a tough choice that the leadership has to make. But I think from design perspective, from research perspective, you can, I do agree that it's not really a best idea to build a product for every kind of persona that we can think of. And even if you have multiple, like even 2 or 3 personas is already too many. So you have to figure out from a research perspective, hey, what is the common ground that we can find? And once you find that common ground, it's hard to do that, and you have to make some tough choices. And then you have to convince the leadership. And I think that's once you find the common ground, probably a relatively easier job to convince the leadership, just because, as you said, and nobody has resources. We work with various teams at Microsoft. Even they are always talking about how there's not enough resources to build for everyone. And that's where I think product design probably comes in, and that's where the skills come in. But once you have that, it's a real resource allocation question. So I definitely agree with you on that. Let's switch gears a little bit. I'm really curious in terms of building out the team. So you built out design teams at various B2B companies today. How do you start? What do you look for when you first initially building out the team? What do you look for in skills of your designers? Yeah. And how do you go about building a design team for people in our audience who are doing it for the first time? How do you go about building those design teams?
Yeah, it's a really important and hard question. I think especially in smaller companies, I think what we look for, and a lot of times what in some ways I still look for in a lot of candidates is just, curiosity, right? Are you curious as a designer? Like, are you showing, just the process of being interested and learning new things, and can you demonstrate that? And certainly in smaller companies, you want people to be, self-starters. At Vanta, we have one of our principles is bias for action, right? We want people that, can come in and actually get things done. So in smaller companies, certainly you can sort of screen for that. But I think in general, especially for smaller companies or even mid-sized companies, we really think about, if you've heard of T-shaped individuals before, right? So people that have a breadth of skills in design, but maybe go deep in 1 or 2 areas. And then taking that sort of stem of the T and how does that complement other people on a team? So if you're really strong in design systems, for example, maybe you hire somebody that's really great in research, right? How do you, so sort of thinking about all these pieces as complementary skills and looking at the whole picture and how does everyone complement each other? I think that's really important. You don't want 7 people that, are sort of the same skill set as you have. You want people that have a variety of skills to create the team.
And when you're kind of, making these, once you're building the team, you have to also go about managing and up-leveling the designers that you have hired and researchers that you have hired. Any words of wisdom on how to be effective design manager and design leader?
Oh yeah, I mean, well, I hope that I can give words of wisdom here. I know you probably have to ask.
You've been doing that for 10 years, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think well, I mean, everybody has their own sort of design philosophy and sort of management philosophy. But I think it's how do you create safe space for folks to do their best work? I mean, I think that at the end of the day, that's as a manager, I think that's super important. So that's my guiding philosophy. How do you give space for people to do that? and be supportive of them. And how do you, we talked about complementary skills, right? So when you think about folks that you're bringing into the team, they're also thinking about their career, and you would love it if they stay with you forever, but they might not. But developing those other skills outside of maybe their the STEM on the T, right? How do you make them kind of a more well-rounded designer, and them to grow with the organization? I think that's super important to think about when you're hiring. You're not just hiring for that moment in time, but you're contributing to that person's growth over many years. We were like at LeadGenius, we're really fortunate to have some really great people there. And a lot of those folks, we might be up to like half a dozen, or maybe it's more now, of first-time founders that are alums, right, from LeadGenius. And it's really great to see that sort of ecosystem expand, and those folks go on to really terrific things. Like as kind of a manager and someone who built that, helped build that organization, I have a huge source of satisfaction there. They might not have stayed with us forever, but that's super great. They're going on to other things, building companies. I don't know, maybe there should be like a LeadGenius index or something we could invest in, like with all those companies. I would invest in it, but
yeah, I think it's so true. It comes from hiring and like making people who are risk takers and complementary skills, and giving them space to make those mistakes and make it easy for them to to learn from their mistakes. And that's why you're absolutely right. They're probably like or six. Some of them are actually in our panel today. There are several founding companies that came out of LeadGenius. I think probably more than 6 at this point. That actually brings me out to my next question and last question of the session. Looking back, we LeadGenius and then multiple companies after that. Now you're starting your stint at Vanta. In the last 12 years of your career, what are the lessons learned? What we probably did a lot of things right, but we also did a bunch of things wrong, as we all as we know.
Yeah.
What do you think are the kind of top things where you thought that we could have done better, or you could have done better in the last 12 years?
Oh boy, that's, I don't know. Do you have enough time? Like we only have 15 more minutes in the session, right? So I don't know. You always remember the things that you screw up the most, I guess, right? Like as a founder, like you never really think of, I think that's, people talk about, celebrating wins. Even if you're not a founder, I think it's important to celebrate wins, because often you sort of get bogged down into like what's not going well. And so it's important to take a step back and think about that. Like I think, well, you might disagree with me, but I think like we talked about talking with customers in a purposeful way. I think that we could have done even more of that. Like we could have, that was one of the learnings for me. I think we did talk to customers a lot, but you can always do more there. And we could have done it, I think, in a way that, at the time, maybe we weren't equipped with the tools or the skills, and that's where hiring comes into play, where, we could have been smarter about how I think we asked them those questions and really tried to, really tried to do that more often. I think that's one area. I mean, I'm sure you have a list also of things, but that's one thing looking back on it, is to be even more hyper focused on getting to those insights, on getting to those customer problems.
Yeah, I agree. I think we did a pretty good job at talking to customers, and we had a community, but we could have done a lot more on talking to both the end users and then higher ups in the org. We talk to our decision makers, but what about people who these decision makers are reporting to? What do they need to see from our product for them to feel that they're getting value? I think we didn't do enough of that, and we could have done more. And talking to end users, I think it was hard to get access to end users because they were always so busy, the salespeople and the marketing people. Yeah. But I think we could have done. I agree, that would have been my number one.
So lesson for all those folks that are on the call or listening to this later. You're a founder, even if you're not a founder, like however much you think you're doing that, do it maybe 50% more.
Do it more.
More for that. So
fantastic. So I have a couple of questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A box. The first question we have is actually a very interesting question. It says minimalistic or more colorful modern design for end user. For a while it was minimalism everywhere, and I feel like we are kind of moving away from that a little bit in the design community. Do you have preference? Which one do you like?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I mean, yeah, those trends are coming. Like new morphism, I think, right, was the thing for like a hot minute, and obviously that is now. And I don't know. I think I think thinking about like trends is probably the wrong question to ask, right? It's really, we talked about being user-centered. It's like, are you solving problems for your customers? Especially in B2B, not to say that people don't care about like the latest trends. And again, we talked about, why can't B2B, feel like a modern consumer application? I think that's really important. But, I think just, are you solving the problems for your customers in a smart way? Like that's really what matters. And, you can overlay kind of the latest trends or the UI, latest trends in UI on top of that. And I'll leave that for, maybe the visual designers out there, but I think that's the most important thing.
I will say I was getting really tired of minimalism. I think minimalism for not just like in UI, UX design, but like in general, like our cars are all gray and they're all like black and gray interiors. I do feel like minimalism has gone a little too far in this world. And I would, coming from India, where traditional Indian design is not minimalistic. It's it's a lot of colors, a lot of maximalism. I think
you can just take what's interesting now, everything looks like I see a lot of retro like it actually reminds me of like old Mac computers, right? Like in terms of like typefaces that harken back to the 80s. Like, so I don't know, you just need to get ahead of it, I guess. So maybe we should just design for the 90s now or something, or 2000s, and then
yes, I agree. There's nothing we're designing. There's nothing we're pretending as if we're back in the 80s, and nothing was more popular in the 80s than 50s design sensibilities. So so
fluorescent fanny packs
love it,
are back in now. Who knew? So if you can incorporate that into your design aesthetic, why not?
Absolutely. I would that's a challenge for my visual design team for today. There's another question coming in. I think essentially, especially in B2B, a lot of products that rarely update their design and their modifications seem pretty minimal from an end user perspective. In the person said, it's considered he thinks it's considered a good sign of product growth when product evolves rapidly. What do you think is an ideal time frame for a product to kind of have a major evolution in its lifetime? Like when, I guess another way to frame this question is, how long before you think product is kind of stagnating without any major update or major evolution?
So this is like the dreaded redesign question, like when you try and justify a huge redesign of your product or something.
That's exactly right. Yes. When can you justify? How often can you justify a major redesign of your product?
Every 6 months on the first of the month. I don't know. Yeah, that's a really hard, again, it depends on the, not to answer with a non-answer. I think it depends on the goals of the organization. And, like to do a redesign, just to do a redesign probably may not make a lot of sense. Unless maybe, if you're doing it, I think you weigh it just like every other refactor, like if you're on the dev side, right? Like, you accrue usability debt over time, and some ways, especially smaller companies that are growing really fast, they accrue a lot of usability debt, and things spring up organically, and somehow now your information architecture might not make sense, and the experience from one end to the other starts to not make sense. So I think if you're seeing friction with your customers and they're not able to do some of their tasks and do them well, or they're backsliding, getting worse, I think it's time to consider. It's always really hard. Like we thought about it a lot. I feel like we went through a handful of those, and it's never a simple trade-off. It always takes longer than you think. Are there other things you can do to alleviate some of those pain points or some of those problems? rather than, I think, a full-on redesign, or I think even calling it a redesign is sort of dangerous too. But I think it's dependent on the situation, but you have to sort of weigh those for your organization.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree. I think I am a big believer in evolution rather than revolution. Product, especially, once you have reached a little bit of maturity, and that comes earlier than you would think. Once you've reached a certain maturity, it should be, kind of building anything from scratch should be looked at skeptically.
Yeah.
And especially if it's designed, not to mention that this shouldn't be redesigned. And I think the time frame that this is actually Bogdan's last question. Hey, Bogdan. I think the timeline that you mentioned, kind of 18 months to 24 months, I would say that's still pretty aggressive for major redesign. I think major redesign should drive not from, and I agree with Dave, not just from, or how long has it been. It should evolve from, hey, are there things that our users, our customers want to do that they are not able to do because of where the design is today? So I definitely agree with that. There's another question coming in. How do you get more participants from stakeholders in the user testing lifecycle, particularly making pivots to solve problems? Stakeholder execs often, they don't want to share the vision, design experience vision for problem solving. So essentially, how do you make the stakeholders and correct me if I'm not understanding the question correctly, but it seems like there is sometimes hesitation from the stakeholders' perspective to share the vision, share the future, in case this has kind of more either from competitive side or from just making your customers feel uncomfortable about the evolution of the product. How do you get buy-in from stakeholders in situation like this?
So it seems like kind of two-part question. One is it's sort of clarity of vision, right? And the other one is getting buy-in. And I guess in some ways those things could go together. We asked about, I think before, like sort of mistakes we made like running the company, right? I think one of the other ones is having a vision that shifts too much over time, right? And or not communicating that with sort of the entire organization. So hopefully folks are in organizations where that is really clear, because I think if it's only 85% clear at the top leadership level, then you can rest assured that it's maybe only 50% clear for other people on the team. So I think having that vision is super important. Feel like you don't have that, I think try and get that, or is there a way to create your own vision on the design side and maybe share that with the rest of the organization to help foster that conversation? So that's maybe one thing. And maybe the question was also a little bit about sort of stakeholder involvement with research. It sounds like a little bit like,
right,
how do you make sure that people are busy, right? And like it may not be realistic to have the entire engineering team sit on calls,
or even if they're even if they have time, they might not have the vision. They might not be able to visualize the problem. They often can't, they can't see the experience. How do you solve for that problem as well? And they can't have the vision and visibility.
So again, I think it's important, just putting a stake in the ground is really important, and it's okay. Like if it has to shift later, that's okay. But I think having a common understanding, regardless of which group you're in, especially when you're in design and you are talking with customers and doing early iterations and discovery work and thinking about, are you asking the right questions that can then support that vision? I think you can quickly go off in an unintended direction if there isn't clarity on the team for that. So even just saying, hey, as a group, I think we're doing X, and bringing people along with that vision is important. So I'm not sure that answers the person's question, but
yeah, it seems like what you're saying is, as a designer, as product people, the best we can do is clarify and kind of bring more into the focus of the vision
that comes from the company vision. It's hard if that's the best you can hope for, is clarification of company vision, or changing the company vision or the group vision into a product vision, transforming a company or group vision into a product vision. That's the role. But if there is no clarity, enough clarity on the company vision or the group vision, it's hard to kind of translate that into a product vision, and then hard to take that back to the stakeholders and say, here is what the vision is going to look like, because it's just not clear, because the clarity hasn't come from the group leaders or the other company leaders.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important, but also, design can play a role there also. Are there things that design can do to represent their point of view, and collaboratively with the product team or the rest of the team? Are there things that, they can contribute to keep people excited about what that future vision might look like? There's a lot of design is visual also. So how do you portray that to the rest of the organization? Are there ways that you can creative ways that you can do that to get people jazzed about what you're shooting for?
So in some ways, you're like translating the obscure company vision or a group vision into kind of more kind of clarified product vision, and get people excited about it and get stakeholders excited about it. That's a big part of your role.
I think design can help lead those conversations too. I think design, what's great is design for a lot of organizations, an increasing number of organizations, has a seat at the table now, and that's really amazing. I guess wield that power responsibly. There's a lot of really great things you can do.
With great power comes great responsibility, and designers
right.
definitely have a lot more influence into the organization today than they did 10 years ago. So, well, that's all the time we had. I think that's a great place for us to stop. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Dave, for sharing your wisdom. This is as good of a takeaway as I can share. If I was to distill conversation today, I would say, designers, you have a lot more influence. You have a lot more stake in the future of your organization, and it's important to wield it, but wield it wisely. And with great power comes great responsibility. So with that, thank you, Dave, for joining us. Thank you, everyone who joined and asked questions, and the recordings would be available. Connect with us on LinkedIn, and if you have any other follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much. This is fun. So
fantastic. Cool. Thank you, everyone. Bye.